Imagine this. You're living in a small town in Vermont in the early 1900s. Life is simple, quiet. Then a brutal murder rocks the community, and suspicion falls on this man named Elroy Kent, a figure already known for his strange and sometimes criminal behavior. So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack the case of Elroy Kent using court records, newspaper articles, and witness accounts to try and understand what led to this tragic event. And we'll be grappling with questions about the death penalty, the limitations of evidence, and how mental illness was understood back then. Get ready, because this story has more twists and turns than Vermont back road in winter.
What makes this case particularly fascinating is it throws us right into the heart of a justice system, grappling with very limited tools. We didn't have the sophisticated forensic science of today, and the understanding of mental health was just beginning to emerge.
So let's start with Elroy himself. He was born in 1878, and from a young age, he was already turning heads.
His early life kind of paints a picture of a boy who was always pushing boundaries. He was prone to pranks and running away, and by the age of 7, he had already dipped his toes into a life of crime.
7 years old, what kind of crimes were we even talking about at that age?
Well, it began with petty thefts, things like stealing mileage books from the local train station. They had no real monetary value, so it seemed more like mischief than an attempt at personal gain. He even set a neighbor's plow on fire, claiming it was just a joke.
That's a strange sort of joke, isn't it? Almost like he was testing the limits, seeing what he could get away with.
Exactly. There's a sense that he was driven by this need to disrupt, to defy expectations. As he got older, though, the stakes became higher. He began stealing horses, robbing stores, even attempting burglary. The consequences grew more severe, but the pattern of reckless behavior continued.
It's almost like he was on this trajectory of escalating trouble. And then comes the incident that really changes everything, the train jump in 1902.
This event is crucial because it introduces a new element into Elroy's story, a severe traumatic brain injury. Trying to escape from prison, he leaped from a moving train, fracturing his skull.
And it wasn't just any fracture, right? The details are pretty gruesome.
Indeed. Doctors discovered a piece of rotten wood over 2 inches long embedded in his brain. They had to remove a portion of his brain tissue and pack the wound with gauze. It's remarkable he even survived.
You have to wonder about the long-term impact of an injury like that.
Absolutely. This wasn't just a bump on the head. This was a significant brain injury that could have had profound effects on his cognitive function, behavior, and impulse control. Following this incident, he was transferred to a mental hospital.
So here we have Elroy Kent, a young man with a history of increasingly serious offenses, now suffering from a major brain injury. And it's at this point that we need to introduce the other central figure in this story, Dileia Congdon.
Dileia was a beloved member of her community in Wallingford. Despite being deaf and facing the social stigma that came with that at the time, she lived a full and vibrant life.
She sounds like a truly remarkable woman.
From all accounts, she was. Neighbors looked after her. She inherited the family farm, and she was known for baking cookies for local school children. It's this stark contrast between her kindness and the brutality of her murder that makes this case so deeply unsettling.
So let's talk about the murder itself. It happened in July of 1908. Dileia was found murdered in her pantry. Can you tell us about the crime scene and the initial investigation?
The crime scene was horrific. Evidence suggested a struggle, a sexual assault, and a brutal death inflicted with a wood-splitting axe. It was a shocking event that shook the community to its core. Initially, suspicion fell on a man named Frank Rogers, a known tough character in the area.
Why was he targeted?
It seems the evidence against him was largely circumstantial, and there was a lack of physical evidence linking him to the crime. He was eventually released, and that's when the investigation shifted focus to Elroy Kent.
And what led them to suspect Elroy?
Well, for one thing, he had escaped from the mental hospital just weeks before Dileia's murder. And then there were the sightings. Several people reported seeing someone matching his description near her farm in the days leading up to the crime.
But sightings alone aren't enough for a conviction. Was there any physical evidence?
Perhaps the most chilling piece of evidence was the discovery of the initials EK carved into the wall of Dileia's barn.
Hold on a second. Like a calling card.
It certainly raises that possibility. Was it a deliberate attempt to taunt the authorities, or was it something more impulsive, a compulsion driven by a troubled mind? These initials combined with his escape, and the sightings quickly made Elroy the prime suspect.
Okay, so we have a suspect with a history of odd and violent behavior, a recent escape from a mental institution, and what appears to be his initials left at the scene of the crime. What happened next? Did they apprehend him right away?
Not exactly. What followed was a massive manhunt that gripped the entire state. Newspapers were filled with updates and every lead was scrutinized. But capturing Elroy Kent proved to be much more difficult than anyone anticipated. Elroy seemed to vanish into thin air. But then these peculiar incidents began to pop up all over the state. Reports came in of strange behavior, petty thefts, and more unsettlingly, those chilling initials, EK, appearing in various locations. It was like he was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, but each one only deepened the mystery and heightened the public's anxiety.
It sounds like something out of a dime novel. The elusive criminal taunting the authorities, leaving his mark wherever he goes.
Exactly. And this wasn't just a story confined to police reports. Newspapers were having a field day with it. Every new development, every supposed sighting was splashed across the front pages. The public was both captivated and terrified.
Did all this attention make it harder to catch him?
It certainly didn't help. Elroy became a sort of folk legend. Some saw him as a dangerous menace, while others, perhaps romanticizing his actions, saw him as this cunning trickster, outsmarting the authorities at every turn.
So how did they finally catch him?
Well, the intense pressure seems to have forced a misstep. Elroy was eventually apprehended in a small town after attempting to steal some supplies from a general store. It seems even masterminds need to eat.
I guess that's true. So he's finally caught, brought to trial. What was the prosecution's case against him? What evidence did they present?
This is where the complexities of the legal system and the understanding of mental illness at the time come into sharp focus. Remember, this is 1908. Forensic science was in its infancy. There was no DNA evidence, no sophisticated crime scene analysis like we have today. The prosecution's case rested heavily on circumstantial evidence.
So we have the sightings, the initials at the crime scene, and his escape from the mental hospital. Anything else?
They also relied heavily on witness testimonies. People who claimed to have seen him near Dileia's farm, others who testified to his erratic behavior, and perhaps most damningly, another inmate claimed to have overheard Elroy confessing to the crime.
It sounds like a lot of pieces pointing in the same direction.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the limitations of understanding mental illness back then. How did that play into Elroy's defense?
The defense argued for an insanity plea, citing Elroy's history of bizarre behavior and, crucially, the traumatic brain injury he suffered from the train jump. They called upon hospital staff who testified to his unpredictable actions and emotional instability.
And I imagine that 2-inch piece of wood lodged in his brain for years had to be a factor in their argument.
You would think so, right? But here's where it gets really interesting. A psychologist, considered an expert at the time, examined Elroy and declared him not insane.
Wait, hold on. He had a chunk of wood in his brain. A history of strange behavior, was deemed unfit for prison and sent to a mental institution. And they're saying he's not insane.
It seems almost unbelievable to us now, but we have to remember that the understanding of mental illness and brain injuries was very different back then. Their diagnostic tools were limited, and their understanding of how trauma could impact the brain was rudimentary at best. It's quite possible that what we might consider clear signs of mental illness today were simply not recognized or interpreted the same way back then.
So despite the defense's arguments and the seemingly obvious signs of mental instability, what happened? What was the verdict?
Tragically, the jury found Elroy Kent guilty of murder and sentenced him to death.
It's hard to hear that. Knowing what we know now about brain injuries and mental illness, it feels like a profound miscarriage of justice.
It's certainly a case that forces us to confront how far we've come in our understanding of mental health, but also how far we still have to go in ensuring that our legal system takes these factors into account. But the story doesn't end there. The execution itself is a whole other chapter filled with its own set of unsettling details and implications.
Oh, I have a feeling this is going to be tough to hear.
It's a story that speaks volumes about the era, the methods, and the ethical dilemmas surrounding capital punishment.
Okay, so Elroy has been convicted and sentenced to death. You mentioned the execution itself had some unsettling details. What happened?
Well, this was 1912, and the state of Vermont was, quite proud of its newfangled electric trapdoor system for hangings.
Oh, okay.
6 men each held a button, and only one button released the trapdoor. The idea was that no one would know who had actually delivered the fatal blow, easing the burden of guilt on the executioners.
It sounds like they were trying to make the process more humane, at least for those carrying it out.
That seems to have been the intention. But the execution didn't go as smoothly as planned. When Elroy dropped, the rope snapped, sending him plummeting to the ground.
Oh my goodness, that's horrific.
It was a gruesome spectacle for everyone present. They ended up retying the rope and hoisting him back up, leaving him to slowly strangle to death for over half an hour. The prison doctor tried to claim that Kent died instantly from the initial fall, but reports surfaced that he was still alive after 7 minutes of hanging.
7 minutes. It's almost like they were trying to cover up the extent of the botched execution.
It certainly raises that question. And remember, this is a man whose mental competency was seriously in question. The public outcry following the execution was immense. People were horrified by the botched procedure. And this case fueled the debate over the ethics of the death penalty, particularly when dealing with individuals who might be mentally ill.
The whole thing sounds like a nightmare. Did anyone face consequences for the way the execution was handled?
There doesn't seem to be any record of that. However, this wasn't the first time Vermont had a botched hanging. A few years earlier, a woman named Mary Rogers suffered a similar fate, with the rope breaking and leading to a prolonged and agonizing death. It seems as lessons weren't learned, or that the focus on a seemingly more humane system obscured the inherent brutality of capital punishment.
You have to wonder about the impact these events had on those involved. Those who witnessed it, those who carried it out.
Yeah.
It couldn't have been easy to live with.
You're right. Governor John Meade, who authorized the execution, even publicly stated his wish to never again experience something so harrowing. But even beyond the individuals directly involved, this case became a touchstone for broader discussions about the justice system, mental health, and the morality of the death penalty. Elroy Kent's story served as a stark reminder of the fallibility of our justice system and the potential for irreversible mistakes.
It's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
And as if this whole story wasn't complicated enough already, you mentioned something about a deathbed confession.
Yes. Decades after Elroy's execution, a man came forward claiming to be the real murderer. He said he let Elroy take the fall because he was an easy target, already seen as a strange and troubled individual.
That's a bombshell. Do we know if there was any truth to this confession? Was it ever investigated?
It's difficult to say for sure. This confession came long after the key players in the case had passed away, and it's unclear if it was ever formally investigated. But even if it was fabricated, it casts a dark shadow over the entire case. It makes you wonder how many other cases throughout history have ended in similar miscarriages of justice, with innocent individuals bearing the ultimate price for crimes they didn't commit.
It's a chilling thought for sure. This deep dive has been quite a journey. We've gone from petty thefts to a traumatic brain injury, a brutal murder, a botched execution, and finally a deathbed confession that throws the entire case into question. What are some of the key takeaways you hope listeners will walk away with?
On one level, this is a story about Elroy Kent, a troubled individual who was failed by the system. It's a story about Dileia Congdon, whose life was tragically cut short. But it's also a story about the limitations of our justice system, particularly when it comes to understanding mental health. Back then, the understanding of brain injuries and their impact on behavior was in its infancy. Today, we might look at Elroy's case through a very different lens.
It makes you wonder what would have happened if he had received the mental health care he clearly needed after that train accident. Could this tragedy have been prevented?
That's a question we can only speculate on, but I think the bigger takeaway here is the importance of constantly questioning our assumptions, recognizing the limitations of our knowledge, and advocating for a more just and compassionate approach to dealing with those who struggle with mental illness.
I think that's a message we all need to hear. Elroy Kent's story may have taken place over a century ago, but the issues it raises are timeless and relevant even today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a truly complex and thought-provoking case. Until next time, keep those brains engaged and remember that justice, like history, is rarely as simple as it seems.